What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. Larry Rifkin and John Kropsic. And John, we get into all kinds of different trends. None of the variety that you read about, like the hottest thing of the day. We're looking at issues that are really affecting people's lives or cultural icons and milestones that have an impact. And this topic today is on the Gap. Now, it's not that...
It's not the store?
Fall into the Gap.
That's it.
Remember that?
Yes.
I remember a lot of these jingles. I can't help it. Fall into the Gap.
The Gap.
But actually, this is a report that has come out about a shortage of affordable homes in America. And it's not a good trend. It's really not when you look at it.
We live in a state that has that problem.
Yeah.
We have that big problem.
Yeah, the elderly can't stay in a lot of the cities or towns where they, raise their families. A lot of young people can't afford to grow into the homes that their parents had.
Exactly.
I've been reading, John, about this whole movement toward downward mobility in our children. And it really is nerve-wracking to think that a lot of kids who've done all the right things and gotten all the right pedigree and degrees, and yet they can never expect to do quite as well as their parents.
You look at, though, we weren't hardest with that debt that they're right off the bat, to get those degrees. So right there, we're putting them at a negative because now they got to pay those off before they can even start establishing credit to buy a home and to move on.
That's right. And of course, homes are so much more expensive than they were when you and I were starting out. And the minute you have a home, then you've got some equity that you can trade up for. Right. But until you get your first one, and a lot of these kids are coming out and they want to live in the most urbanized and most cosmopolitan areas, and they're the most expensive.
Right, that's the most expensive real estate going.
And now daycare. If you decide to have a family, oh my goodness, you're saddling yourself with an incredible expense in addition to things that you and I perhaps didn't have to deal with in the past.
Well, because of cost now, you can't even, if one needed to stay home, you can't do that because everything is so expensive.
And in the old days, let's be honest, John, you and I had a mother or a father or a caregiver, an aunt or uncle who lived nearby and was always available.
There was always somebody home.
Exactly. So that's no longer the case necessarily. Well, the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Now, this is a group that, John, dedicates itself to looking at public policy, trying to determine how people with the lowest incomes in the U.S. can afford housing that's decent, of some quality. The other thing that young people are walking into as they come out of college is a very stagnant wage pool, historically.
Stagnant or going down.
Or going down, yeah.
Right.
So you look at all these factors, and it's rather disturbing. It really is. So joining us today to talk about all of this is Sarah Mickelson, Senior Policy Director at this National Low Income Housing Coalition. But some of the statistics that we're going to focus on, the nation's 11.2 million extremely low-income renter households account for over a quarter of all renter households and 9.5% of all households in the U.S. And there's a shortage of over 7 million rental homes right now.
Well, and on top of that, you think about the people who are basically the working poor. They're working to keep the house over their head. I mean, we got some big problems.
Well, I love when the president talks about all the jobs that people have. Well, we don't talk about the quality of those jobs.
Right.
And then one person might say, yeah, Mr. President, I've got 4 of those lousy service jobs that I'm struggling daily to commit myself to have the energy to pull myself together and get to them on the first shift, the second shift, the fourth shift.
Right.
I mean, it's not easy out there. It's really not.
No, it's not. It's not. And I sort of blame the universities too, because I think they're graduating kids with degrees that aren't really functional in this society.
Well, people are going to have to make a lot of decisions. I mean, do I really go into debt because I have a passion for the humanities or whatever it may be? I mean, I was able to major in political science and history and find my way into a career in communications ultimately. But I don't know how easy that is today. A lot of people really do need very technical degrees in order to pursue a true vocation directly related to the things they studied in college.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, I mean, there's a lot of blame to go around for this problem.
But in the meantime, there are a lot of people who really just can't afford to have a roof over their head. That's what we're going to be talking about today, the gap, a shortage of affordable homes here in America. Joining us on America Trends is Sarah Mickelson. She is with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And I know that this coalition has been in effect since 1974, I believe. Sarah, how much has the whole issue of affordable housing changed over many, many years?
Yeah, that's a great question because a lot of people are talking about the affordable housing crisis now, and it's really important to know why it is that more people are feeling the pinch. And largely, from our perspective, that's because there are more renters than ever before, but our federal investments in housing have not kept pace. And the result has left millions and millions of extremely low-income people without the resources that they need to pay rent and make ends meet.
I think a lot of people may be confused about what public or subsidized housing is. We might have had a concept of it as being large tenements or housing projects, but that's not really the way it happens today, is it?
Well, most people who receive federally subsidized housing receive housing vouchers that help make up the difference between what they can afford to pay in rent and what their rent is, capped at a reasonable amount. And those are people who are using their housing vouchers in the private market, in communities across the country, in urban, rural, and suburban communities alike. And so HUD programs really run the gamut and have a far, far reach into the country.
Is there a certain trajectory as to where housing policy is going now that we have so many renters and so many people barely able to make ends meet these days?
I think we're making some really good progress, but there is so much more work to be done. And we also face, at the same time that we're making progress, we're facing new threats that are very significant and real. On the progress side of things that have happened recently, we were really pleased to see that despite calls from the president to drastically cut federal housing programs and investments, that in fact Congress rejected that proposal and instead provided a 10% increase to HUD programs. That was really historic in many ways, not only to get a one-year influx of 10% more funds, but also when you compare it to what the president had requested, it was a significant rejection of his proposal.
Under Ben Carson, I mean, has there been a lot of movement in terms of policy that is really definable?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Secretary Carson and the Trump administration have made it very clear that their approach to housing is to walk away from it. And so you've seen them in both of the two past budget cycles to propose deeply, deeply cutting or eliminating housing programs altogether. And we've also seen attacks from them to housing benefits through rent increases, work requirements, de facto time limits, other burdens that are really aimed at restricting the number of households who can receive help, despite what we know about the growing affordable housing crisis.
But you're saying Congress has been pushing back at some of those attempts?
Thankfully, yes, Congress has been pushing back on the budget side especially, but also on the rent proposals to increase rents. Saw in both of the last budgets, Congress didn't include any of the changes that HUD had been seeking. We're really pleased to see that, but we know that we have to remain very vigilant to make sure that we don't see other attempts at rolling back housing benefits. I will say that there are some members of Congress who have introduced legislation that would pick up where the Trump administration has left off with those proposals. And so we're spending a lot of our time educating members of Congress about what that would mean for people and their paychecks.
You've put together a report called The Gap, a shortage of affordable homes. Again, this being the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Tell us the gap. How great is it? When we read some of these numbers, I'm trying to put them in perspective. The nation's 11.2 million extremely low income renter households account for 25.7% of all renter households and 9.5% of all households in the U.S. Is that a growing number?
Well, what you're seeing is with those jobs that are most likely to grow in the coming years, those are ones that pay extremely low wages. But at the same time, housing is not available to those households at levels that they can afford. So you're seeing that population grow, that need grow, but you're feeling the impact of it up the chain as well. So just to give you a little bit of background information on this, we found that if you look at everyone in the United States who is a renter and who's paying at least half of their incomes on rent, 3/4 of them are people with extremely low incomes. And so the real cause of this affordable housing crisis and where you feel it most acutely is among people who have the very lowest incomes. But at the same time, as I mentioned before, our federal investments are just not keeping pace with that growth. And so you see people being squeezed more and more and paying more of their very limited incomes on rent.
So we see, of course, and we've done a podcast about tent cities here in the U.S., and we see that a lot of people are displaced or having a very difficult time of it. And this goes across the country, though you point out in your report where we are with every state and large metropolitan area. But I think many of us wonder if somebody's spending 50% on their housing, that's way out of line with what is anticipated as a good budgeting for any household.
That's right. I mean, you can imagine when you're making such limited incomes to be spending at least half of it on a rent. That means you have very little resources left over for everything else that you need, including transportation or childcare costs, groceries. And the end result is that you see a lot of people pulling back on spending in those areas, but that impacts their long-term health. It impacts their children's ability to achieve in schools. It has impacts on their ability to climb the economic ladder. So housing is something that it has to be foundational and seen as foundational for all other aspects in people's lives. And when you pay too much in rent, it means those other parts of your life also suffer.
And even though they may be subsidized as it relates to housing, invariably they're going to need help with other things like oil and heat, and they're going to need help with transportation and daycare. I mean, all of these things, if you have such a low income that 50% of it is going toward your housing, you are going to be on other subsistence programs as well, I would imagine.
Right, and that really goes to the heart of these recent efforts by the Trump administration and some more conservative members of Congress, not only to roll back housing benefits, but to try to find ways to roll back people's health care benefits and programs that provide food security, programs that provide help people maintain the heat in their homes in the winter. All of these programs are ones that are under serious attacks by the administration and proposals for elimination, and ones that, we in the housing space have to also pay really close attention to, because we know that cuts to those programs have a direct impact on the people that we're serving through housing.
I know on another podcast we were talking about people, let's say, who we see in New York City or Washington, D.C., and they're involved in some kind of service activity. Maybe they're running a food truck, or maybe they're, providing us with a bagel in the morning, whatever it may be. And we say, how do they get into Manhattan or Washington every day? Where do they go out to in the evening? And what kind of disparity is there between what they're making and what they have to spend on housing in these very concentrated and yet gentrified areas as they continue to find themselves squeezed by so many factors?
Yeah, and that gets to the real fundamental problem that's happening here, where more and more people are spending more and more of their income on rent, and that has the most acute impact, the most severe impact on exactly those people that you mentioned, people who are working in the retail space, who are home health workers, who are working at other low-wage jobs, maybe jobs that don't provide sick leave or other benefits, health benefits, the result of which is that people really don't have the resources that they need just to pay rent and get by. And that's why in many communities, especially along the West Coast, you're seeing a rise in homelessness for the first time in years, and that should be really concerning to anybody.
Sarah Mickelson is with us from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And Sarah, when we see that there are 7.2 million affordable and available rental homes in terms of the shortage, 7.2 million. So talk about what that dislocation really looks like on the ground. Give us perhaps one or more metropolitan areas and either the responses to this or the way this problem is manifesting itself.
Yeah, another way to look at that data, and I think it's helpful to think of it in smaller numbers, but one way to look at it is that for every 100 people who are extremely low income, there are only 35 units of housing that are affordable to them and available to them. So that means that the other 65 really have no choice but to find housing that they can't afford and to put more of their incomes towards rent. And so it's not surprising at all that those people are spending, about 3/4 of them are spending half of their income on rent. And this does play out in communities across the country differently, but I'll say we see the same trend regardless of what state you're in or what congressional district you're in. You still see this real steep decline in terms of the number, the shortage of housing. You see that get worse as incomes go low. Some of the states that have the most acute housing needs for the lowest income people are Nevada, that has, for example, 15 homes for every 100 households. Places like California that has 22 homes for every 100 extremely low-income renters. But even in places where it's the best, thinking of places like North Carolina that has 46 homes for every 100 households, Kentucky has 55 for every 100 households, we're still talking about a severe shortage, even in the best circumstances.
So who is really addressing this? Is there federal policy to address it? Are states having to grapple with this? I know we come from Connecticut, and we didn't even have a housing department for many years, and this governor did establish one, and he is very proud that he has built some of the first affordable housing in the state of Connecticut in many years, but there's still a yawning need for much more of it, and we see that there are a lot of families here in a very wealthy state having difficulty every day. So who's responding to this? Are towns and cities, states, the feds? Who's working on this?
Lots of folks, lots of communities, lots of local government officials are looking at ways to try to address this problem. And I think it's important to know that there's a role for every level of government to play in addressing this crisis. And each of them have different tools that are available to them. So you'll see a lot of states and communities are looking at things like changing their local zoning practices to help facilitate the private market and building affordable housing. And those are really important, crucial things that states and communities can be doing right now to help increase the production of housing that's in their communities. But it's really important to know that even if all of the states and communities are looking at their zoning and making positive changes, there will still be a need, especially for people who have the very lowest incomes. And that's really a market issue. That's because even if you were to reduce the cost of production through those changes, it still wouldn't make a lot of financial sense for developers to build housing that's deeply, deeply targeted to the lowest income people, because the amount of money that they could take in rents just isn't enough to develop the property in the first place or to keep it operational. And that's really where the federal government has to step in. This is a national problem. It demands a national solution. We know already what works. There's so many examples of really effective programs that have been proven to lift families out of poverty. We know it works. It's just a matter of funding them at the level that's needed. Today, 1 in 4 people who are eligible for housing assistance get any help of any kind. That means the other 3 in 4 get turned away, and that's largely because we're just not funding the programs at the scale necessary.
So should it be that we lower the thresholds in terms of where somebody becomes eligible for these programs, or do we need to encourage more development of the affordable housing, or a combination of those things?
I really think it has to be a mixture of different solutions because every community is different. But Congress needs to be looking at funding housing vouchers, which help make existing housing more affordable. So if you're in a location, for example, that has plenty of housing stock, but that stock's not affordable, housing vouchers are vital to make sure that the lowest income people can access those homes. But in many other places, we need to see much more production of housing, especially housing that's deeply targeted for people with the lowest incomes. So that means robust funding for the National Housing Trust Fund, which was developed precisely to meet this need, but also deeper income targeting among existing programs.
You talked earlier about zoning, and I know that here in the state of Connecticut, there are a lot of communities that just do not welcome affordable housing. They think it brings a lot of other social ills. So the suburbs in this state really quarantine a lot of the affordable housing into urban areas. Is that a problem all across the country?
That is one of the most significant barriers to building affordable rental housing. Call that NIMBYism, or not in my backyard syndrome. So problematic that in many communities they might have the resources, but the question is, where can they build it? And for a long time in many communities we saw a concentration of affordable housing developments in poor neighborhoods or neighborhoods of color. And the result is a concentration of poverty. And it's really important that going forward we take active steps to correct those wrongs to help address racial segregation that was exacerbated by federal policy and put in place by federal policy. And to do that, we need a much more comprehensive approach that looks at building affordable housing in areas of opportunity that are close to good schools, transit, healthcare, but also a plan that revitalizes communities in a comprehensive way and preserves existing affordable housing in those areas too.
And do we have a definition of affordable housing, or is that in the eye of the economy of a region? In other words, what's affordable in Alabama may be very different than what's affordable in Arizona. How much do we calibrate all of that?
So federal policy does take that into consideration, and typically what you are looking for is housing where a household would pay no more than 30% of their income on rent. And that's why you see housing challenges across the country, regardless of where people are living, because it's a combination of those two things, wages and housing costs. So while housing costs might be cheaper, for example, in Alabama, so wages are also lower. And so it doesn't really mean that there's a meaningful improvement of housing affordability even in rural communities. I think that goes to a lot of people's preconceptions about affordable housing or about the struggles that people are facing. I know that I've heard from many people, why can't they just move to somewhere more affordable, maybe move out to the suburbs where that's where housing might be cheaper. But that's not really a solution if we know that incomes are also lower in those communities, and therefore there isn't a meaningful improvement on affordability.
Somebody listening to America Trends might say, well, I remember when I grew up and there were all of these public housing projects. What's happened to them? And I was reading that there was a national push toward privatization that has led to the loss of more than 250,000 units of public housing over the past 2 decades. So how out of step or out of favor is public housing today?
There's a lot of challenges facing public housing, but it's primarily a challenge of Congress not providing the resources that are needed to keep that housing in good condition and available for future generations. Public housing is a really great resource for the 2.5 million people who are living in public housing, many of whom are seniors and people with disabilities or families with small children. It's a very important resource, but we've seen over decades a chronic underfunding of public housing. Today there are billions and billions of dollars in backlog capital needs to keep that housing in good condition. And so you've seen many of these public housing agencies turn to privatization because there's just been this massive disinvestment from Congress. I will say that last year when I mentioned we got a 10% increase in HUD programs last year, that included nearly $1 billion additional investment in public housing. And we take that as a really good sign, and we're going to continue to push for more more resources in the future.
Well, in this article that I referred to, Carl Redwood Jr., who's the chair of the Hill District Consensus Group in Pittsburgh, a community advocacy group, he was quoted as saying, and Sarah, I'd like your reaction to this, "We can't resolve the housing crisis if we turn to private developers. The real solution is publicly owned and operated social housing, public housing. Without government involvement, market-based investors, banks, and real estate interests will continue to swoop in, flip properties, and gentrify neighborhoods." Could you comment on that?
Well, I definitely think that public housing, social housing are important pieces to the puzzle, but I wouldn't want to de-emphasize the need for federal resources to do it. There's really no way to build housing that's deeply affordable to people who have the very lowest incomes without some form of resources from federal, state, and local governments. While I think it's really important to look to other forms, maybe community land trusts and other resources that are out there, either way, we need a much greater investment at the federal level as well.
Well, tell me, some of the experiments that have been done recently, one being the rental assistance demonstration project that started in 2012, and the entire portfolio of public housing in San Francisco was converted to privately owned housing. How is that demonstration project going?
Well, we've seen efforts in the past several years to expand the number of public housing agencies that are allowed to participate through RAD, the rental assistance demonstration. We want to make sure that when public housing agencies are using RAD, that tenants are protected and that all affordable housing stock is maintained. But like I said before, RAD is largely an offshoot of the fact that Congress has failed to invest in public housing at the level needed. If Congress were willing to make that investment to restore those capital needs, fix that backlog in terms of keeping public housing in really good condition and available for the future, we would probably not see RAD needed as much.
When we hear the term Section 8, I want people to understand what that means, because anybody who's really entering into this conversation about affordable housing is going to hear that. And so somebody might say, well, does the money go to the individual? Does it go directly to the landlord? Explain how Section 8 works.
Yeah, that's a great question. When somebody is in need of housing assistance, they would go to their local housing agency and get onto the wait list for housing resources. Many times it can take several years before they're able to get assistance because the program is not funded enough. But when they do, they get a voucher that they can go out and use with private landlords or housing providers. And when they are able to find an apartment that they can use, essentially HUD provides that landlord or that housing provider with the difference between what a family can afford to pay and what the rent is. And so families still contribute their fair share of their income towards rent, but the federal government helps pick up the difference between what they can afford and what their rent is. And that allows them to live in areas where housing costs keep growing and where wages are flat.
When I look at the philosophy coming out of Washington, I'm wondering if this representative of legal services in New York has it right. He said, from Washington, the whole mantra is don't spend money on poor people if you can avoid it. But if you have to spend something on them, make sure that rich people get to profit from it. Is that the operative philosophy these days?
That's a really good question. I really think that you are seeing, and I mentioned this before, the Trump administration and congressional attacks on housing benefits and health care benefits, programs that help people have food security. You really are seeing attacks across the board, across the spectrum of safety net programs that serve the very lowest income people. And at the same time, 6 months ago, you saw Congress pass a massive tax bill that largely provided tax benefits to billionaires and corporations. That's deeply, deeply unfair, and it's just contributing to economic inequality that we're seeing across the country. And I think that really tells you where many people in Congress, where their priorities are.
I want to thank Sarah Mickelson for being with us from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and she has shared with us the results of their study, The Gap, a shortage of affordable homes. If somebody wants to get a hold of this information, Sarah, how can they do that?
Well, I'd encourage them to go to our website, www.nlihc.org. You can find that and other resources there, including information about state and local housing needs.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for being on America Trends today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.